with university and professional language learners from Asia since 1989. He received a PhD in International Comparative Education from the University of Southern California and has been involved in the development of language learning programs in a number of contexts. He is currently the chair of the master's program in International Language Education, TESOL at Soga University, Japan. Dr. Richmond is the immediate past president of the Japan Association of Language Teaching, JALT. Dr. Richmond is also professionally active with other teaching associations in Asia, North America, and Europe. Dr. Richmond conducts workshops, publishes, and presents on a variety of professional activities and research projects, which include teacher education practices, curriculum and professional development, and developing learners' critical thinking skills. Please welcome Dr. Richmond. Over to you, Dr. Richmond.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon, or this afternoon for you, this evening for me here in Tokyo. I was hoping to do some breakout rooms today. I understand that that's not going to be possible today. Is that correct? Someone there?
Yes, yeah. That is correct. Yes.
Okay. Well, I will go through some information for you, and I would like to make this a little bit participatory, and I'll be asking you to please join in and ask questions or bring up any concerns that you have as I'm going through the presentation. I'm going to try to share a file with you from via the chat. Let's see if I'm able to do that. And this is simply some information that would help you follow along in my presentation. There's a little bit extra information there that I wasn't able to put in the individual slides without making them too busy. And that's got some of my contact information as well. As was mentioned, I currently live in Tokyo, Japan. I am the chair of the Masters in TESOL program, and that allows me to work with a number of students who are becoming teachers either in secondary or in tertiary institutions, primarily teaching English, but we also have a number of our graduates who go on into different roles and to different contexts and different institutions. I've had the pleasure of working with teachers primarily in Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as the United States and Europe. Unfortunately, I've never had the chance to come to the Middle East professionally, so I look forward to that sometime in the future. I am particularly interested in rubrics because they are crucial to our program. We are in the beginning stages of seeking accreditation from the United States for our graduate program and therefore our graduate school of letters. Of course, our program and our university and our institution and our program are all accredited through the Japanese system, but we are seeking international accreditation from the United States with a different set of criteria as part of our work as one of the identified super global universities here in Tokyo and throughout Japan. So that has led me to become much more active and involved in developing and evaluating and creating syllabi as well, and based on rubrics, rubric-based assessments that's connected to that syllabi. So that's what I'm going to be basing much of my presentation on today. So if you will allow me to, I will share my screen and go ahead and begin the presentation. Just a moment.
Please.
So today, I do want to talk not only about the development, but also the effective implementation of rubrics for assessment. I'll be talking also, let's see, there we go. I want to talk a little bit in general about assessment and the purposes of assessment and how rubrics fit into that larger context. Then I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about the definition and purpose of rubrics. And then from there about the development of rubrics. Now, I'm not familiar with the different types of faculties and departments that many of you are coming from, but I've tried to provide some examples from a number of different fields of study, particularly those that I identified at your university. I was kindly given some information about that. And I've tried to bring in some examples from business, from engineering, chemistry, as well as I have some that I will be showing from my own program. My hope was to work with you in small groups and have you to discuss and talk about some of those aspects and develop some ideas on that. I may still try to do that. So I definitely would like for you to participate and speak to me and offer me your ideas and as we're moving forward. Lastly, I would like to talk some about rubrics and the curriculum and overall accreditation. This is something that we are moving into. This is a much larger area, so I will not focus too much on that. But I'll be talking a little bit about that. And then lastly, I'd like to open the floor for any comments or questions that you may have related to anything that I've had the opportunity to share with you. So beginning with just an overall background of the purposes and characteristics of assessment. Rubrics are one aspect of a basket of different strategies and different tools that we have as educators in order to assess our students and determine how effective our programs are and how they have been how our students have been able to learn the materials, learn the key concepts, and to be able to perform the types of activities that they need to accomplish in order to be successful in our program, our programs or our degree programs. One of the main purposes of assessment is to ensure accountability. When I discuss assessment with my teacher trainees, I indicate that we enter into a contract with our students and also our university when we agree to teach a particular course. So we have goals and objectives that we as teachers ensure that we will be providing or helping our students reach, and our students on their part actually agree to participate and engage in the learning system in our classes. We also basically have a contract with our institutions to provide the type of instruction and type of curriculum that we have been asked to provide in our class. We also, of course, we want to evaluate students' work. We want to identify the differences in student performance. One means of assessment is to see to what extent students have reached the goals and objectives in our course, and what are the differences between different students. If students, some students have performed more effectively and other students may have fallen short, it's important for us to identify those students and be able to determine why some students are successful and why some students are not. We also want to be able to communicate student achievement, not only to students themselves, but also to our colleagues, to our administration, to any type of oversight committee or institution at the local or national government levels, or obviously in accreditation agencies as well. We also want to help students learn and demonstrate their learning. So from a more of a humanistic approach to education, we want to provide opportunities for students to demonstrate that they have in fact learned what we want them to learn in class, what we hope that they have learned in our courses, in our labs, in our laboratories, etc. And this needs to be based on clear criteria so that students can gauge their own process, their own progress. And this is not only criteria that is important for us as teachers to have, but also important for students to have, so that they understand clearly what's expected of them, where they stand on a continuum of hopefully success in our programs, and how they can specifically improve. Assessment needs to be efficient. We are all very busy teachers. We have many students, we have many administrative responsibilities, and we have many research responsibilities. So we recognize that we must spend time on our assessment procedures, but they must be efficient so that we do not waste time on those activities. In addition, they must be consistent, not only consistent among our students or possibly with our students or possibly between different courses that we teach, but they need to be consistent across institutions and across faculty members within different programs, such that assessment in one class is not unduly rigorous compared to the assessment in another similar course. And lastly, on this particular slide, assessment needs to be fair so that students understand what will be assessed, how they will be graded, how that assessment will be collected, and how they can make progress and how they can improve upon their own performance. One of the points that I want to stress is that assessment is not only for the purposes of evaluation of students, but we want them to be able to learn from the assessment process. So when I am developing some type of assessment and having that and designing that for a particular course, I want that to be an opportunity for students for reflection and learning. I don't want simply to have students take a test and I give the scores back. It's important for me to be able to create a situation so that that assessment process is actually a learning opportunity. And so that students can learn from their mistakes and grow in the process as they continue learning. So that's a key of what I'd like to focus on today when we talk about rubrics. Typically, when we look at assessment, we oftentimes fall into a default assessment strategy. And those that often is based on objective assessments, the standardized test or objective tests, some possibly multiple choice exams. And those are a very important tool in our toolbox of assessment. Objective tests are extremely effective for large student numbers. And those assessments are very effective in determining what students know and what they can recall about key concepts. On the more negative side, effective multiple choice exams are extremely difficult to create and need quite a bit of analysis and evaluation in order to ensure that they are both reliable and valid. But nevertheless, large-scale objective assessments are definitely one of the important tools of an overall assessment plan. However, when we move to focusing on not only what students know, but what they can do, then the larger objective assessments are not as effective. there may be situations in your particular courses or in your particular faculties where you need to determine to what extent students are able to conduct independent laboratory investigations or guided laboratory investigations, or how they can develop reasoned arguments or to be able to communicate their ideas. These are much more complex um, um, activities, and therefore they need a more complex approach to the assessment process. And when we talk about these types of more complex activities to determine to what extent our students can accomplish these more complex tasks, other assessment types are more effective, such as research papers or demonstrations of problem solving, either through a laboratory situation or an open-ended question on an exam or some type of research paper. Model building, where they have certain problems or certain challenges they need to overcome and or consider. Debates, where arguments have to be presented and addressed and debated. Oral presentations, where students have to convey their ideas in very logical and well organized and professional manner. So all of these are simple examples of other types of assessments that may be more appropriate to assess more complex activities that our students need to become proficient at. And this is where rubrics can play a very important role. Rather than looking at a single score, rubrics are based on a variety of components that are multifaceted, but can be utilized to assess more complex activities that we ask of our students. When I am looking for a clear definition of a rubric, one of the definitions that I have come up with in the past is this particular definition from these are two researchers from Scandinavia. And just let me, I've got something here that's in, there we go. All right. So a rubric here, the definition used here says that a rubric is a scoring tool for a qualitative rating of authentic or complex student work. And I think that's a key point, that we're looking at complex student work here, which includes criteria for rating important dimensions of performance, as well as standards of attainment for those criteria. So again, you can see by this definition that this is a much more complex system of an assessment tool. Right? I want to pull out a couple of key words here, and those are criteria, dimensions of performance, and standards of attainment. All right? So these are key points that are very important in this particular definition that I'd like to come back to a little bit later in the presentation. Another description is distinguishes rubrics from a scoring checklist. Again, a scoring checklist is also an effective tool in a range of assessment tools that can be used in an assessment program. But a rubric is distinguished from a scoring checklist by extensive definition and description of the criteria or the dimensions of quality that characterize each level of accomplishment. So again, you see here that there's much more information, much more clarification, much more description of what would be the successful attainment of a particular activity by a student in a particular context in which they are going to be assessed. Again, I'd like to pull out a couple of key words here: extensive definition and description of the criteria or dimensions of quality. And again, I'm going to use these and come back to these ideas a little bit later in the presentation. So if we continue on, rubrics have been extensively researched in the literature. My background is education. And of course, in education, rubrics have been very popular for more than 5 decades. Their use and their sophistication has significantly changed over that time. But this is an area that is very common in education and that has been very well researched. Nevertheless, the research focusing on these particular rubrics, these particular areas of these tools of assessment have become much more prevalent in other areas of research, other fields of research. If you could take a look at the document that I shared with you, I'm going to move on to that first table, that table 2, which describes rubric evolution based on Scorpus and ProQuest analysis of articles. And you can see there that these are an examination of research papers that focus on rubrics, and that these are focused outside the social sciences and education, right? So we understand that rubrics are very popular in education and social sciences. So this particular paper by Gallardo in 2020 actually focused on other fields of study, because we understand that rubrics have not historically been as popular in those fields of study. You can see there in 1996 to 2000, there were papers in physics, in veterinary science. And as we progress from left to right up until present day, you'll see that there are more fields where rubrics, the research on rubrics become more common. Medicine, nursing science, and moving on to economics, energy, engineering. More recently, chemistry, computer science, and then lastly, you can see business and biochemistry, etc. And that last column on the far right-hand side, you see creative thinking. And I have here on my slide, critical thinking. Critical thinking reaches back all the way to Bloom's taxonomy in the 1950s. But when we are shifting from a knowledge-based economy to more of an application of knowledge and the development and innovation of ideas, we're shifting and focusing much more on the ability of our students to critically think and critically analyze. And Bloom's taxonomy focuses on a number of levels of critical thinking. And rubrics position themselves very effectively as a means by which to assess and also explain how students can move from lower order critical thinking skills to higher order critical thinking skills, for example. So returning to the handout on table 2, you'll see that between 1996 to 2000, there was a limited number of publications, about 23. But as we move on to more recent years, that has increased to 262. So you can see that there is quite a change in the focus and the number of different pieces of research that focus on rubrics. In addition, you can see the topics that are related to the rubrics, such as at the early stages, feedback, formative assessment, both of which are extremely important. We move on to self-assessment and self-efficacy, and then peer assessment and reasoning skills, again, connected to critical thinking skills. And most recently, we have metacognition. So you can see also not only the popularity and the research focus has heightened on rubrics, but also the topics and the type of research has also changed. Obviously, there's also criticisms, which I'll be talking also a little bit later. the lack of validity or reliability, the redundancy, or the student's lack of participation in design. So this is just some information to demonstrate to you that this is not just a focus of my field of education in the social sciences, but this is becoming much more prevalent in the hard sciences, physics, engineering, chemistry, mathematics, etc., particularly as all fields of study are beginning to more closely consider the importance and the relevance of critical thinking and the ability of students to be proficient in actions and activities rather than just knowledge in our particular fields. So rubrics provide students a number of bits of information, right? Most importantly, rather than just a score or a grade, rubrics provide students much more detail about expectations about what will be assessed, right? What the expectations would be for them on a particular assignment, on a particular examination or assessment, or in a particular course. Also would provide them information on the standards that need to be met, right? Rubrics by nature are criterion reference. Therefore, there is a set of criteria against which all students' performance is measured rather than norm reference, such that students are not competing against other students in the classroom, but they are competing against an ideal criterion referenced goal that is laid out and clarified in a rubric, as well as other documentations in a syllabus or in a course or curriculum. Based on being provided this information, students have an indication of where they are in relation to the goals of the class. Students can find that along that continuum, students can place themselves and identify where they are in this process of trying to achieve this criterion reference goal or the goals and objectives of a particular class. Based on that, through the process of going through assessments that are based on rubrics, because students understand what's expected of them, they understand where they are on that particular continuum, they actually have an opportunity to reflect and determine for themselves how they can better perform on the next assessment, set goals for themselves, and determine specific strategies in order to reach those goals. This is extremely important. As much more of the education focuses on this type of reflection. But I also want to caution, one of the challenges that we face in our classes is that it is sometimes difficult for students to reflect and to do this self-assessment because they've never had the opportunity to do so. So many students who come into our university classrooms, they come from high school situations where rubrics have not been used, where expectations have not been shared. Therefore, they've never had the opportunity to reflect. They've never had the opportunity to self-assess. So it's important for us as instructors to take the time to teach those skills so that our students will have the opportunity and the ability to understand how to reflect on their own performance, how to set goals, and how to identify a number of strategies in order to improve their performance and reach the goals that they would like to reach in our particular class. In addition, this allows the use of rubrics, particularly if you work with students who are working in groups. This allows for more effective collaboration. With a rubric where all the expectations are clear and clearly described, students are able to collaborate more effectively, to share responsibility, to identify responsibilities among the group, and to collaborate more effectively. Again, when students know where they're going, oftentimes they are more effective in their efforts to achieve the goals and objectives set before them. Rubrics also provide a number of benefits for teachers. When rubrics are used effectively, that increases consistency and ratings of performance or products or understanding. And this is also consistency in ratings of performance across different faculty members, instructors, and also different tasks and different courses. If I have time, I'll share with you some of the rubrics that we use for our application process. So when students come into our or apply to our program, we have a basket of assessment procedures. We have, because of our program is fully in English, we have English requirement. We also have, we look at previous GPA and the traditional aspects of applications. But we also look at a written statement of purpose, as well as an interview and letters of recommendation. And for each one of those areas, we have multiple rubrics. For example, we have one rubric for language. We have another rubric for content, looking at how students have effectively answered questions in the interview, or how students have effectively included relevant information in their professional statement. As well as the language side. So we have multiple rubrics that we use so that our evaluation of applicants is consistent, not only from application period to application period, but also among interviewer to interviewer, all of our faculty members who are involved in that process. We also have, because we use rubrics, as teachers, we have data to support grades. We hopefully do not often get questioned about the grades that we give students, particularly at the end of the semester, but invariably, once every couple of semesters, one of our faculty members will get questioned from a student. Why did I receive this grade? Why did I not get an A or a B? Why did I get a C? Or why did I not fulfill the requirements of the course? By using rubrics and using that as an assessment tool, when those questions come up, we can, as instructors, we can simply identify and point to those rubrics and say that these are the areas where this student may have been strong. These are the areas where this student may have been weak. Therefore, this is the result for their grade. So this is very good data to support our grades. At the same time, it provides us a method to provide effective feedback, particularly if students are using the same rubric multiple times as they improve their skills in a particular activity. For myself, that may be multiple presentations that a student is conducting, and they will see in what areas of the rubric they were strong, what areas they were weak. Also writing in my context, they're writing research papers, research proposals, or argumentative essays. And each time I'm using this almost the same rubric with some slight differences. And so I can point to specific points where they need to improve in certain areas. This would also be true in, for example, laboratories, or in the business when doing case studies, right? So this is applicable to a number of different areas in different fields. It also increases the objectivity of our assessment. How do we determine what paper or what assessment is an exceptional assessment compared to one that we feel that is substandard? With a rubric, that those descriptions are very clear, they are public, they are provided to the students, they are used by the faculty members, everyone is very clear. This is very objective and also very transparent. One of the important aspects of developing a rubric is for all faculty members within a particular department or faculty to be engaged in the process, particularly in the piloting of the rubric and also providing feedback and clarification on the rubric. And by doing so, that demonstrates a shared belief or expectations of competencies within a program. All the faculty members understand what competencies are expected, what proficient level is, how a proficient level is described, and how a substandard level is also described. So by going through the process of developing and utilizing rubrics, all faculty members have a shared understanding of the overall components that are necessary for their particular program. So if we continue on, there are still challenges that also emerge from research from across these different fields. Number one is that rubrics are time consuming. They are time consuming to develop, to clarify, to revise, to pilot, and to share with students. And that was, if you remember from one of the criticisms, was that students may not have the opportunity to be participate in that development. And I would strongly recommend that it is important for students to be involved in that process, to be able to provide feedback, and to gain some type of ownership of that rubric so that they have actually been part of the development process. There is some contradictions within the literature related to whether or not rubrics save time or not. In most cases, the time commitment is much heavier at the beginning when the rubric is actually developed. As faculty members become more effective and knowledgeable and familiar with the rubric, the efficiency of using the rubric significantly increases. At the same time, in some cases, there are mixed results in the literature. But in general, the time commitment is heavy at the beginning when developing a rubric, and the benefits are realized a bit later in the process. Rubrics, once they are set, they are less flexible. So there are key criteria, there are key descriptions of how students' activities should meet certain criteria, and that becomes somewhat inflexible. But there are ways in which to maintain some flexibility within those rubrics. Some criticisms is that rubrics tend to become formulaic, that students, rather than using those as a guide to guide their development of materials or guide their activities or their development of essays or argumentative arguments, they use the rubric as a checklist. I have to have 3 examples to get this score. If I only have 2 examples, I'll get this score. And that is a fair criticism, but what our experience has been is that rubrics may be formulaic at the beginning when students are just becoming used to them and beginning to understand the different components. But as students become more proficient at the activity, they become less formulaic and more of a guide of how students can be more successful in their particular activity, whatever is being assessed. So this is sort of an overview of the research that has been focused on rubrics over the last 20 years or so. I want to come back to the quotations that we discussed earlier, and I want to pull out these key points because these key vocabulary, these key terms that are in those quotations begin to provide for us the foundation of developing rubrics for our own use in our own teaching context. And if I take the red items there, we come up with three broad areas. One are dimensions of performance, another is descriptors, and the last is scales. Now, dimensions of performance are areas where discrete areas within a particular activity that need to be covered effectively. Within an essay, for example, if you're writing an essay, one dimension would be organization. Another dimension would be fully developing arguments. Another dimension may be the use of external references. Another dimension may be language, focusing on grammar or appropriate academic language use. The scales would be the standards of attainment. Roughly, this would be roughly equivalent to an ABC scale, but oftentimes those are more focused on terms rather than grades or letter grades or numerals, such as proficient or acceptable or unacceptable. And we'll talk some about that more specifically in just a moment. The descriptors are within the grid where each level and each aspect is defined and detailed descriptions of the criteria or the quality are included. This is very important so that students understand exactly where they lie on a particular continuum. Where are their shortcomings and where are the areas that they need to improve? When we put that into a rubric, you'll see that scales often are across the top, dimensions are across the left-hand side in this case, and the descriptors are in each one of the boxes there in the middle. If you go back to the handout that I gave you, if we're on page 2, you'll see that you'll see the first figure that is on your screen with the scales across the top, dimensions on the left. The second example is the dimensions are on the top and the scales are on the left. It's really a personal choice. You'll also notice in some of the examples that I have, some of them will be like the example that you have on your screen now, when we have the lower level scale on the left moving upwards to the right. In other examples, the higher level scale is on the left, and you move down to lower scales as you move to the right-hand side. Again, that's a personal preference, but I think what's important is consistency. So if you are developing multiple rubrics for your course or your faculty or your department, choosing one organizational structure for your rubric so that all the rubrics follow the same structure, that would be very effective and very useful. So if we move on to an example, this is a very simple example that I was able to find online. And this is, the assignment is to write a blog post appropriate for a specific audience exploring themes of the reading for a particular week in class. And they have 3 areas on the left-hand side. You have engagement, perspectives, and uses of examples. In this case, the scales on the top are the highest on the left and then go down 2 steps to the right-hand side. So you have exceptional, which is your goal. Almost there is somewhere in the midway, and then not yet is the lowest level. So obviously, we want students to be able to achieve the exceptional area and all 3 dimensions. So if we look at engagement, the entry reflects in-depth engagement with the topic. If students haven't quite achieved that, then the entry reflects moderate engagement with the topic, or not yet, the post reflects passing engagement with the topic or no evidence of engagement with the topic. Now, I'd like to ask you a question and see if I can get an answer from anyone. If you look at that top line, do you see any problems with that? Is that clear to you? Do you have any any questions about that? Let me go through the next two, and I'll come back to that and see if anyone can answer that question for me. From the perspectives, the second level, you'll see that in the exceptional category, we have multiple perspectives, right? And awareness of limitations of their own perspective. Almost there, the center category, some new sites are offered, but they are not fully developed. Whereas the not yet, no new insights are presented within a larger context. So this is very clear. We're looking at different perspectives, integrating those perspectives in a particular blog post. Lastly, the use of examples. All right. In the exceptional category, we have integrates examples with explanations or analysis, right? And almost there are explanations are based on, are mostly based on examples or other evidence, right? So there's not coherently integrated. And in not yet, few to no additional examples. So it's mostly a description. So again, this is a description of what's expected of the students. So if I go back to that first level, to that engagement level, personally, I see a criticism for that first level. I was wondering if anyone here could give me an idea of what that might be. Do you see any problems with that first level engagement? I can't see you, so you'd have to speak out if you have any ideas. So for me, that level of engagement, I'm not sure if I was a student in this class, for example, or if I was a colleague of this faculty member, I would not be 100% sure what engagement actually meant. So the entry reflects in-depth engagement of the topic. My question would be, what is this engagement? What engagement are we referring to, right? I'm not really sure what engagement means. And that's very important, because if I, as a learner, as a student, if I'm not sure about what that means, then I don't know how to achieve those particular goals. I don't know how to improve my performance, right? So it's very important for these descriptions to be extremely clear, the criteria to be very explicit, so that students can be able to reflect effectively. Now, my next slide here is, so here you see, these are some of the examples. So this is the scale across the top, the dimension, and of course, the descriptions that we've already discussed. Now, what my next goal here, this is when I wanted to have some breakout rooms for you, is I wanted you to give it a try to put together some different types of scales and dimensions, and maybe even a few descriptions together for some very lighthearted rubrics. When doing rubric workshops, one of the most common and one of the classic examples is baking the perfect chocolate chip cookie. It's very easy, it's non-threatening, and everyone's had a chocolate chip cookie. And surprisingly, there are lots of different opinions about what makes a chocolate chip cookie very delicious. So that's just a sort of a fun assignment that you would have the opportunity to work with a small group on. But if you wanted to work with something a bit more academic, delivering an effective presentation is an example of a rubric that most faculty members are familiar with to some extent. So we're not going to be able to use breakout rooms today, and you're not going to be able to share that. So let me just give you some examples here. So this is a rubric about a chocolate chip cookie, right? So you have across the top, you have your scales from delicious to poor, based on in the dimensions on the left-hand side, or the number of chocolate chips, the texture, the color, the taste, the richness. And you can see here that the number of chips in every bite, the taste, whether it's home baked or store-bought, whether it's golden brown or a little bit burnt around the edges. So this is just a lighthearted take on the use of a rubric. However, it's also a very useful tool to demonstrate that among faculty members, there are many different opinions about what constitutes a proficient achievement of a particular task, or in this case, a delicious cookie. Some faculty members like chewy, some others like crispy. So all of that has to be negotiated and discussed. One that's a little bit more straightforward is a rubric for presentations. And this is very common. This is one of the most common rubrics that's used across different fields and across, particularly in education. And you can see, again, you can see the dimensions on the left-hand side, the organization, the subject knowledge that is demonstrated, eye contact, which is very important, elocution, which is the speech, and visual aids that are used. So again, you have, in this case, you have the scales are actually not vocabulary, they're actually numbers. And so they go from low to high, from left to right. Here, organization, the audience cannot understand, compared to the right-hand side, student presents information in a logical, interesting sequence, which the audience can follow. Subject knowledge, student does not have a grasp of the information, cannot answer questions about the subject. Again, this is very important. Student does not have a grasp of information. That alone is not clear. How can we assess that? How do we know that the student doesn't have that information? Well, if the student cannot answer questions about the subject, therefore the student really doesn't have a firm control of the knowledge, right? In the case of the middle scale, the student is uncomfortable with the information, is only able to answer some of the questions, but on the right-hand side, student demonstrates full knowledge by answering all questions with explanations and elaboration. So again, this is a very clear distinction, a behavioral distinction of what the student is expected to accomplish in order to achieve that higher level. Eye contact is very self-explanatory, visual aids, etc. So there are many. This is just a very simple rubric, but it illustrates the relationship between the scales, the dimensions, and the descriptors, right? So this is just an example for you, right? So as we move on, then once we start thinking about developing a particular rubric, let's say, for example, that you have a particular task, you have a particular activity, or you have some type of assignment that you want to develop a rubric for. The first step is to identify the skills, knowledge, and understanding you want students to demonstrate for whatever task or for whatever assignment that may be. For a homework assignment or for a one-time laboratory assignment, those skills may be limited because you're limited by time, you're limited by the amount of information that students can demonstrate that they understand or their ability to accomplish certain tasks. On the other hand, when you have a rubric for, let's say, for example, a master's thesis, that can be much, much more complex, much, much more detailed. And at first look can seem quite overwhelming. But when considered on a step-by-step and a dimension by dimension, step-by-step process, then that even a larger, more complex rubric is much more manageable and effective so that students understand exactly what they are expected to accomplish, what they're expected in, for example, in our master's thesis, what specifically is expected in their literature review, what is specifically expected in their results section, and what is specifically expected in their recommendations and conclusions, for example. So all of those are listed within a rubric and presented there so that students can work through that over months of time as they are completing their thesis. Once you identify the skills, right? So this is an example that I've given you. This is also, if you refer back to the handout on page 4, that's more of a list. So this is the writing skills developed by year for laboratory research reports from a Department of Chemistry. And this is Chapman University, and this is from 2005. So in this case, these are the specific skills or the specific components of a laboratory research report that this particular Department of Chemistry wants to focus on. So in this case, the dimensions may reflect these specific skills. And then across the top, you would have the scale of what was successfully achieving that dimension, and what was substandard or unsuccessfully achieving that dimension, right? And these are, so, and as you can see from the handout, as you move up from freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior level, the rubric actually grows, and the complexity of the task grows, as well as the complexity of the rubric and the assessment process. So this is an example of simply identifying the skills and using those as a foundation to develop your rubric. In addition, you need to determine how many levels, right? How many scales do you want to include? Some of the ones that we have looked at include 3. You could use 3, 4, or 5. Again, this is a personal choice, or an institutional or a departmental choice. However, I would caution, try not to make rubrics too comprehensive and too complex. They become counterproductive once they become too complex. Again, much of that depends on the demands of the assignment, as well as the length of time that students have to accomplish that assignment. This is an important aspect as to why it's important to have students involved in this process. They will be very eager to tell you if it is too daunting or too overwhelming, or if it's actually very useful and it's a very useful tool, right? So some of the scales you might want to consider in the simple example that we just talked about, you have just numbers across with the example from the presentations. But you may want to use vocabulary such as inadequate, adequate, good, or excellent, beginning, developing, accomplished, or exemplary, unacceptable, marginal, needs expectation, meets expectations, or exceeds expectations. So these are the typical types of vocabulary that you will see in rubrics. In addition, when you are seeking accreditation, you will see similar scales in rubrics that are used to assess your program. And oftentimes they are based on standards, right? So approaching standard, meet standard, or exceed standard. So that is a tool by which accreditation officials will use to place different aspects of your program along that continuum, and hopefully you will be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of your program, and they will be able to provide you with accreditation. But oftentimes what you will see is approaching standard, meet standard, or exceed standard, right? All right, so at that point, you need to define the criteria, and you need to write the descriptors, right? So this is, in some ways, the more complex and the more time-consuming, and the portion that needs the most feedback, right? So you want to, when you're writing descriptors, you want to avoid use that connote value judgments, such as creative or good. How do you operationally define good? What is good and not good? So some words are not very effective. Creativity, again, that creativity is one of the components of Bloom's taxonomy in critical thinking. And there are rubrics that can be used to assess and determine level of critical thinking, and in some ways, level of creativity. But those are the more abstract the concept, the more challenging devising a rubric to reflect that concept is. So focusing on behaviors such as the use of examples, explanations, use of appropriate referencing, behavioral focus or more observable types of descriptions are more effective. Having said that, please don't shy away from more abstract ideas in rubrics. Those are also important, but they are a bit more challenging. Descriptors need to be brief and understandable, because remember, not only do you need to fully understand your rubric, but you need to share that with students, and they need to be fully aware, and they need to understand your rubric. In addition, as you're going through a norming process and an explanation process within your faculty, all of your colleagues need to understand that rubric and hopefully be able to utilize that rubric effectively and reliably. So you will not be the only person who will be looking at this rubric. Your stakeholders, including your colleagues, your students, the administration, and certainly accreditation assessors. They will also be looking at the rubric. They will need to be able to clearly understand and to be able to use that rubric effectively and reliably. All right? So when you're writing descriptors, one of the most effective ways to sort of brainstorm is to think of the examples that would of exceptional work and examples of acceptable but not very good, and then examples of unacceptable, and then find the specific criteria within those three that distinguish each one. Right? So you can describe the best work that you could expect using these characteristics. So using the dimensions that you have selected, write the description of the best work that you could expect your students to produce, or even maybe surprisingly produce. An exceptional student, right? And with each criteria, with each dimension, what specifically would that exceptional assignment look like? What would it include? How would it go beyond even possibly your expectations, right? So that's your top category. So that gives you the goal, the ultimate category, the ultimate expectation placed on students. On the other hand, as we move on the other end of the dimension, what would be the worst or the most average product using, but would still be acceptable, right? This is your C paper, your C presentation, your passable but not very impressive assignment, right? So what would be necessary to meet the minimum expectations in each one of the dimensions, right? And this becomes the description based on all of the broken up into each one of the dimensions. This becomes the lowest acceptable example of an assignment. And then lastly, we want to look at what is not acceptable, right? What falls below your standard, and that needs to be clarified, right? So as you remember from our examples, that our example rubrics earlier, students did not use examples. They did not engage with the information. So therefore, that was a lowest level, possibly an unacceptable development of an assignment, right? So based on that, you have your top category, you have your average but passable categories, and then you have your unacceptable. And then if you have intermediate areas, intermediate levels of scales, then you can determine what is the midpoint between each one of these. So in this case, you may have 5 scales. You may have the exemplary, the passable, the unacceptable, and you may have one intermediary level within each one of those that would take the categories of the dimensions and on either side and provide a description that falls in between each one of those. So the descriptors are challenging. and we'll take time. This is where the most time is used. Also, when sharing this with your faculty members or your other students, that's the norming process. So you want to not only share the rubric, but share examples of student work, obviously anonymized, but you want to share examples of student work. And so that this is an example of the lower category. This is an example of the top category. So faculty members are clear about what they're looking for and what they should expect to see in different students' work. This is also what we, not only an explanation of the rubric, but also a norming process. So even though, for example, if we do placement for my students based on some type of writing sample, even though I've been using, I actually helped develop that rubric and I've used it for many years, every time we begin, all faculty members who are involved in that assessment process, we sit down, we randomly take 2 or 3 papers, we use the rubric, we come up with scores, and then we compare those scores amongst each other. Now, sometimes we're close, we're a half a point away, and that's okay because we'll average it out. But if we're more than 1 point away, we want to go back and look and say, okay, based on this dimension and that description, what did you identify in that particular assignment? What pushed you into this higher scale? Whereas I'm on a lower scale. So we not only show what our scores are, but the explanation, the identification of specific components within an assignment, so that we not only each one of us understand the use of the rubric, but each one of us knows we're all looking for the same type of criteria. We're looking for the same type of examples. That's a norming process. And we may do 50, 60, 70 assessments, and every 10 or 15 assessments, we'll check. We'll stop and say, okay, let's take a look at the last 3, make sure that we're on the same page, and then go through the process. Again, this is time consuming, but it's very accurate. It's very transparent. It's very objective. And it's very reliable as we compare, we're constantly comparing our assessments with each other. That process of piloting and revising, particularly with students being involved, other faculty members being involved, helps to ensure that everyone involved, all the stakeholders understand all the criteria, all the definitions, all the meanings, so that everyone is on the same page and the rubric can be used most effectively. So one of the points that I was hoping to have you do is to analyze some examples of rubrics. And I'm on page 5 now, and I had 3 rubrics for you. I was going to actually ask you to take a look at that, but we'll look at those together on page 5 and 6. So my question was, I wanted you to take a look at these rubrics as far as clarity, how objective they are, how useful they would be, and maybe other aspects of the rubrics. So I can take a look at this personally as what I was hoping that you might have the opportunity to compare on your own. But for example, if you look at the rubric number 1, and this is a problem solving. If I look at that first level, problem solving strategy chosen is not appropriate, is that lowest level. Compared to problem solving strategy chosen is effective. But possibly as a student or possibly as a faculty member using this rubric, I'm not sure what that means. How do I determine? How can I distinguish between one problem solving strategy that is ineffective or only developing, or one problem solving strategy that is actually proficient? So in table number 1, that rubric related to that one dimension, that is not clear to me. I'm not sure what I'm looking for. I'm not sure what I should pin my assessment on. On the other hand, when I look at the partial in rubric number 2. This is only a partial component of a larger rubric. And this is specifically focused on the use of the scientific approach. And we have high, medium, and low. And in this case, we have purpose, design, data, and conclusions. And in this case, the descriptors are very clear. They're very detailed. So as I'm looking at this, not only as a student, but as a faculty member who's utilizing this as an assessment tool, I can determine much more effectively what specifically I am looking for and how I can identify that type of aspect in a student's assignment. Lastly, rubric number 3, which is on page 6. In this case, the rubric is designed in a slightly different way. It's designed more of a list as opposed to a grid. There's nothing wrong with this. For me personally, this is a little bit more challenging to use. It's not quite as holistic for me when I'm looking at all of the different categories in the grid-like pattern. That for me personally, that's more effective. But for some instructors, maybe this list is certainly okay. So there are many different formats that you can put rubrics in. Personally, I'm not very comfortable with this. It's a little bit more challenging for me, even though there's the development, organization, and expression is there. It's a little bit difficult for me to compare excellent organization with good organization because they're not right next to each other. There's quite a bit of text in between the two. So for me, that's a little bit more challenging. Therefore, if I was analyzing these 3 rubrics, personally, I believe rubric number 2 is most effective. It includes enough detail, and it also includes the information in a format that is easy to see, easy to understand. All right. So this is another activity that I wanted you to sort of try. This is to actually choose a topic in your, some type of activity in your particular field of study and come up with just some ideas of dimensions or scales or descriptors. But because we don't have breakout rooms, we're not really able to do that. But you can take a look. Hopefully you'll be able to do this on your own once you have a chance to review some of the information in my presentation. So once you begin to implement a rubric, student involvement, again, that in the research that was identified as one of the shortcomings. And we want students to be involved because number one, they must understand what the rubric means, what the rubric says. At the same time, to share that ownership, it's important, if possible, to have students involved in the development. At the minimum, to provide the rubric to them and give them the opportunity to give feedback. It may be too complex, it may be too demanding, it may be too involved, or on the other hand, it may be very useful. They may be very happy because it will very clearly point out exactly what they need to achieve in their particular assignment. The level of assessment. The level of assessment is also important. How deep into a particular assessment do you want a rubric to go? Rubrics, again, are very effective in looking at complex structures. Let me just go ahead one. Let me go back. All right. So the level of assessment, if you take a look at page number 7 in the handout, here, what I found was a very interesting rubric. It's a marking rubric for assessing students' mathematical knowledge for applied algebra. And on the top, you see a table, and you have the dimensions on the left-hand side where you understand the information given. You work out the strategies. You perform the calculation accurately, and then you answer the problem, right? Oftentimes, my experience as a student of math is you calculate the answer, and you either get it right or you you don't get it right. I know that in my statistics class, in my undergraduate degree, my statistics classes were extremely challenging for me. But because of that, they allowed me to better understand statistics. But in this case, it's not just about getting the right answer. It's about the understanding the information and the strategies used. So the top is a table of the rubric with the scale and the dimensions. And then the bottom square there is an example of a student's answer and then a text assessment based on the rubric. Not only whether or not the student got the right answer or not, but the strategies and the depth of understanding demonstrated by this student on this particular task. So that's what I mean by the level of assessment. Also through the implementation, again, your academic unit, if all faculty members understand, and the students and the administration, if everyone understands the rubric and what's included in the rubric and the expectation, that becomes a shared belief so that we are all on the same page. We always want to get feedback. We want opportunities for reflection and improvement. We improve our rubrics in our program. We improve those every year or two because we always find ways that there are gaps that we want to fill or that there are points that need to be clarified. So this is an ongoing process. A lot of time at the very beginning, but also these are living documents and they actually change over time. And again, this improves the transparency of our assessment process. There are no secrets here. This is what students are expected to do. This is what students need to be able to achieve. Everyone's on the same page and everyone understands. When we move from specific assessments in a particular course or in a particular department, and we move to looking at the curriculum across a particular department, across all classes, or we look at the accreditation process, then we are moving to a larger use of rubrics or a larger alignment of multiple rubrics across different courses. If you remember back on, I believe it was on page 2 of the handout. It was on page 4 of the handout, where you have the expectations of the freshman level, the expectations of the sophomore and junior level, and the expectations of the senior level. As you develop rubrics for all of those levels, for different tasks within those different levels of skills and expectations, you begin to align all of the course outlines, all of the goals and objectives across multiple courses, and you even align that with the mission statement of a particular institution or a particular department or faculty. So the rubrics allow you to examine your expectations, examine your tasks and assignments, and to align those not only within a particular course, but between courses and within curriculum. Again, this increases our shared beliefs and expectations within a particular faculty. Everyone knows what's happening in the faculty. And it also increases our transparency and accountability. Accountability, as I mentioned earlier, between ourselves and the students, between the students and the instructors, and between us and the institutions. It's often required, such types of accreditation and alignment are often required to fulfill accreditation requirements. Accreditation assessors are specifically looking for these type of effective rubrics, how they relate to the course objectives, how they relate to the curriculum across a particular department, and also how they coincide and align with the mission of a department or the mission of an institution. There on the last page of the handout, and also here I give you the link and the reference to a document that I found while I was going through the process of preparing for this presentation. And this is from the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Manitoba. And this looks at the graduate attribute rubric. So these are multiple rubrics, and they're looking at multiple different aspects of the program and how those aspects are assessed, how they are covered by rubrics, and how they align to different requirements and standards which are expected of the program. And I particularly like this reference because the text looks at multiple standards, multiple expectations, and looks at how different broad assessment processes, such as the master's thesis or some type of benchmark assessment program, how each one of those covers different aspects of those standards. It's very, very useful. It's actually color coded, so I think it's laid out very, very well. And as your departments move towards an accreditation process, I think this is a very good model. It's a very useful model to take a look at. So I wanted to be sure and provide you with that reference. So in summary, I want to save a few minutes for questions and answers if anyone has any. Rubrics are extremely useful tools as an aspect of a comprehensive assessment plan. Again, I don't want to imply that I'm completely against objective examinations. I think those objective examinations are very useful and certainly have their place in an overall assessment plan. But I believe that when we're looking ahead to very specific performance objectives for our students, not only what they know, but what they can do with that information, particularly as we move forward to 21st century skills and the ability to use knowledge rather than just obtain knowledge. Rubrics have a very important and useful role to play. Process can be time consuming, yet results in benefits for the academic unit and all stakeholders involved. Rubrics help align beliefs and expectations among faculty members, among students and faculty members, as well as the institution and all those stakeholders involved. Again, one of the most important points that I want to come back to as an educator is that the use of rubrics allows for reflection and improvement during the learning process. It's not just this is your grade and you move on to the next assessment, but this is your grade and this is why you received this grade. This is the feedback that you received, and this is where you need to go for the next assessment, and you need to develop strategies to achieve that improvement. Right? So that's a sort of an overall summary of the key points that I wanted to cover. And I've got about 7 minutes left, I believe. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take those at this time.
First of all, thank you so very much for such a wonderful presentation. Presentation was highly informative, and honestly, I didn't know how to develop a rubric, but now I'm super confident I can develop rubric effectively. Thanks. If you have any questions, please open your mics, or you can use the chat form.
Say. Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, please. Yes, we can hear you.
Can I take the chance?
Sure. I can't see everyone because I'm still sharing the screen. So if the host can help me out and call a name, or if anyone you can speak out, that'd be fine.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Richmond, for this informative presentation. I have one comment. Doctor, developing any criteria, the criteria developed to judge the quality of student work are also critical to making performance assessment a powerful tool for learning. Why? Because the criteria clearly communicate what is valued in the work, what is takes to be successful, and how can we solve this conflict?
If I understand your question correctly, we're looking at defining criteria or descriptors for a rubric, we're not only looking at a particular assignment, but we're also looking beyond to see how they will be successful, not only in our program, but beyond after graduation. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. And this goes back not only to a single rubric, but also goes back to the curriculum development of a particular program. That any program does not exist in a vacuum. Students graduate from those programs, students have to go on and get jobs, and they need to be able to demonstrate their ability to perform the tasks that are expected of them in those positions when they graduate. One of the most successful programs that we have had in our university is in our economics department. And what the faculty did there very briefly is that they actually went to the top 500 the companies in Japan, which many of our economic students were not able to get jobs to. And they actually asked those companies, what type of skills are they looking for? What type of characteristics are they looking for their graduates? And they basically made a list of all those skills. They put those at the top, the goals and objectives of all of the classes, and they broke down those in sequential steps and integrated those throughout the entire program, through all courses. And from a beginning point where economics program was not very popular at our university, none of the students were able to get jobs in those highly competitive positions in those companies, to 5 to 6 to 8 years later, that economics program became the most popular program. And they were dominating study abroad opportunities. They were dominating the ability to get hired in those companies. So the faculty members were very effective at looking beyond their ivory tower, as it were, beyond only their curriculum, and looking ahead to see what were the goals and objectives that were necessary for those students to achieve, to be able to get those jobs. And then they scaffold that back into the curriculum, and they were able to help those students reach those goals. So I think your point is very well taken. We need to look beyond just what we're doing in our class, look at what is facing our students in the future when they graduate. And that is constantly changing. And it certainly has not changed any more drastically than it has in the last year. So again, constantly looking at that and making those adjustments is extremely important. So thank you for that point.
Dr. Zaid, you can open your mic, please. You want to ask a question. Dr. Ziad?
Yes, thank you, doctor, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Richmond, for this wonderful presentation. I don't know if you guys are hearing me.
Yes.
All right. So I have a question from an accreditation standpoint. I mean, sometimes the curriculum or the program is offered to many students from different backgrounds, from having different levels probably in their prior education. And therefore, my question is, can we adapt the assessment criteria, or can we have some flexibility in the assessment criteria just for the sake of the fairness? For example, I'm a computer science teacher, and sometimes, for example, when we teach, for example, how to write a program, we are expecting some students who have previous knowledge in programming to do better than others who did not have this opportunity before. So this is my question. I mean, can we have some flexibility across in the same curriculum across different sessions or different sections or different levels?
Again, a very good question, and a very common challenge that we all face with all of our students that come from very different educational backgrounds. My response would be to maintain the proficient qualities, the specific goals that you want all students to achieve, regardless of their educational background, regardless of their background. I've had many opportunities to think that some students maybe would not be successful in my class or my course because of one variable or another, and I have been proved wrong many times. So I think it's important to maintain the exit, maintain the proficient goals and objectives that you want students to achieve, the exemplary level that you want students to achieve. All students will not achieve that, but you want to keep that as the goal. For those students who maybe might start at a disadvantage, that's where additional support needs to be provided at the lower end of the continuum rather than bringing down the top. I would recommend not bringing down the top, but providing support for those students who may lag behind because they're coming from a different field and they're not as familiar with computer programming as you mentioned. So they need additional remedial or additional support systems so that they can catch up, so that all students have the opportunity, hopefully, to achieve that exemplary level. Now, how that relates to accreditation, again, I'm going to say, try to support all students to meet that exemplary level. However, when you look at accreditation, oftentimes when you look at the rubrics for accreditation and the assessment for accreditation, you have some flexibility that in some cases you have to score 90% on 4 out of 5, and then you've got that 5th one that you can still score 80% or sometimes even 75%, and that's still acceptable for accreditation. So there is a little bit of gray area there. But what accreditors are going to be looking for is not necessarily how many that all students reach that exemplary level. They're going to be very interested in how many students reach that exemplary level, how you can determine to what extent students have actually achieved the goals and objectives that you have set out in your curriculum. But what the assessors are going to be particularly interested in are by those students who start out a little bit behind the starting line. If they're lagging behind, what systems are in place to support those students so that they have a fair chance to be able to reach this finish line at the same way as all other students.
Dr. Gohar asked a question. He wrote in the chat box, "Thanks for your nice presentation. Could you please explain with few examples how to use this rubric system in science courses? And I wonder how to measure the dimensions."
I would go back and see if I can just go back. Sorry that I'm going to have to go back through these. Actually, no, I'm not going to go back. I would refer to, I think the best, one of the best examples that I have to illustrate that, I believe, is in the handout that I gave to you on page 5. When I look at rubric number 2, and again, this is a partial of that rubric. I selected this because as a non-hard science faculty member, when I look at the scientific approach, right, and how do I define that? How do I determine to what extent students are using the scientific approach? By developing this particular criteria, descriptors, based on the scientific approach dimension and the scales across the top. This clearly lays out a roadmap, right? So again, when you're looking within engineering or chemistry or laboratory, whatever task that you are asking your students to perform, look at what would be the exemplary example from those students, the students that would go beyond your expectations. What would they have to do to go beyond your expectations? You know what that is, because if I showed you 2 papers, you could say this is an A and this is a B. The question is why? What are you identifying in those papers to say that this is an A and this is a B? Those are your dimensions. Those are your descriptors. So you need to become explicit about those. Based on your experience, you need to be explicit about those and list those in the descriptors for exceeding expectations, acceptable, and unacceptable. So the question is actually is for faculty members in each field, in each assignment, and each task. What do you expect, and what would you be pleased with? What would you be satisfied with, and what would you be unhappy with? And be explicit about that and present that in a concrete form with concrete examples. So the example on the bottom of page 5 I think is a very good example. And there are hundreds of examples out there. So if you look at rubrics within engineering, rubrics within chemistry, you'll begin to see a tremendous amount of examples in the literature.
Mr. Ahmed asked a question, and then Mr. Tariq asked a question, but I'm sorry, we are run out of time. Right, thank you so very much for such a wonderful presentation. Dr. Khalid, if you like to extend thanks. I think Dr. Khalid is here with us.
Yes, thank you very much, Syed. Professor Richmond, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you with us this afternoon, and sorry if we are keeping you late this evening.
Okay.
Such a wonderful presentation, and we look forward to hopefully have you in person here with us on campus, hopefully after this pandemic is over. Great presentation, wonderful work, thank you. And we look forward to more professional collaboration with you in the near future.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Participant, please, link to workshop evaluation and certification is available. Please give us feedback. Thank you.